8,500 staff members that are on the mandatory raise. And it averages up 5.7% for teachers and then 5% of midpoint for the counselors, nurses, and other non-teaching staff. So the total compensation package that we would be recommending is $24.7 million. What I will say is this includes only the general fund, but all eligible Fort Bend ISD employees would receive an adjustment based on their titles as well, and it would follow the same pattern. So those that are in the child nutrition fund, as well as any of the title funded teaching positions, would be included as part of the compensation package. So to wrap up the compensation, we are compliant, we feel, with House Bill 3. We've allotted about 47.5% of our total increase to salaries, whereas we were required to do 30%. We've prioritized the compensation for those required positions that are mentioned within the bill, differentiated for teachers with 5 years or more of experience. And again, that works out to either $3,000 or $3,500 based on their years of experience, with all other staff members receiving 5% of midpoint. And then finally, if you look at it, the district investment on compensation is almost double the mandated amount, but we feel that that's necessary to remain competitive with those outlying districts that we're going to be competing directly against for staff and talent. For a legislative wrap-up, briefly, the outcome, as Steve mentioned, did not favor the district financially. There's still a tremendous amount of uncertainty that we don't expect to have wrapped up before the budget has to be adopted. The impact of the compression, as well as comp ed methodology, as well as the compensation. We don't exactly know what that's looks like, but we do anticipate that we would need a tax ratification election in 2020 or 2021 timeframe to meet our ongoing commitments and meet district priorities. And I will turn it over to Luis to walk you through the 1920 proposed budget.
All right, before we get started, Mr. Gwynn, I want to apologize for mispronouncing your name. My mind's telling me one thing, and when I read your name tag, it tells me another. So,
well, I am not Peter Gunn, but I'm closely related to him. But yes, it is Gwynn, like Penn Gwynn.
There you go.
Yeah, but thank you.
Sorry about that. I apologize.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mr. Bassett. Or actually, do we want to stop for some questions at this point? Do we have any questions, Mrs. Towson?
I had just a couple of clarifying questions. So if I heard you correctly, the mandate applies to teachers and librarians only.
It's teachers, librarians, counselors, and nurses.
Counselors
for
and nurses.
75%, and then the
Okay.
other 25% is all other employees except administrators.
Okay. And you said we didn't have a definition of administrators.
That is correct.
And so where do we think campus principals fall?
They're in the administrator group.
They're in the administrator group.
Right.
So we are going to take care of them ourselves.
Right.
So my other question was, are we leaving anyone out? And I heard you say child nutrition and title teachers they would be on the same page.
They'll all get raises. So that one slide says, all eligible employees will receive a raise, based on those parameters. Those numbers only included the general fund impact because we're adopting the general fund budget.
Okay.
But those, with extended learning, child nutrition,
Okay.
the federal funds.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I understood we were including everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Go ahead, Brian.
Okay, so for the 1920 school year, I'm not going to read all of this tiny print to you. What I will say is that we have met the publishing requirements for truth in taxation. The the ad appeared in the newspaper on June 5th in 3 papers as required by law. The public hearing is scheduled for June 17th. We have to have a minimum of 10 days, so we have met that threshold for publication requirements. So we are prepared to adopt the budget, assuming the board moves forward with that. For the 1920 school year, the total budget totals $716.9 million. That's with projected enrollment of about 77,000 students. That means we're spending about $9,283 per student, which is a 7.83% increase over the prior year. And on enrollment, we are using the moderate growth based on what PASA presented to you all back in February. We've shared these assumptions with you previously, so I won't touch on a lot of these. What I will say is, again, as Steve mentioned, we are assuming that we're doing current law and receiving that formula transition grant of roughly $18.8 million. And then we have adjusted the compensation component, which was not previously included. We have $24.7 million built in from this that I just showed you a moment ago. So the breakdown of the budget, again, $716.9 million, and I'll walk you through briefly how that works. Again, this does include those compensation adjustments that I mentioned. So in our core business, which is instructional or classroom instruction, we have $578.9 million. That's roughly 81% of our total expenditures. So the majority of our expenditures are going specifically to teachers, principals, counselors, and those that make the school classroom actually run. For district operations, this is what we Long likes to say, what it takes to keep the lights on in the district. This includes utilities, all of the staffing associated with that. That's about 17% of the total budget. It includes IT, police services for safety and security, transportation, as well as the property appraisal services that we pay to the Fort Bend CAD to do the annual assessment of properties within the district. For central administration, that's the remaining portion of the budget. That's just under $18 million. That's approximately 2% of the budget. That includes district leadership, such as the superintendent, finance, which gets you accounting, accounts payable, making sure all the bills get paid, purchasing, human resources, legal, community relations, and strategic planning. And if you look at what percentage that is of our actual employees, that represents about 1% of total district employees district-wide. And again, 2% of expenditures on the budget. So as we look through the investments that we made, we have talked about the bad things that have happened, but in spite of that, we are making investments. So we've talked about compensation, but in addition to that, we have about $20.3 million in new money going specifically to district goals and objectives that have been outlined by the board. Now, unfortunately, because of the way that the funding formula worked, we're not able to do as much as we would like, but we are making what we feel like are incremental adjustments that will help us move towards those goals. So one of the first items that we have are investments in mental health and behavioral issues, including adding additional mental health counselors on campuses. That's about $1.3 million in new funding. For collaborative communities, as part of that, as you're aware, the board approved a new policy, GK Local, specifically related to the philosophy around how we adjust collaborative communities. There's the addition of an executive director in that area that will help move those goals forward. In terms of EDGE, you all recall we have about $3.2 million related to that. And for the expansion, that's going to include school improvement, the addition of the stipends, as well as the activity-based learning teachers. For full-day pre-K, we've talked briefly about that. There's $9.1 million included for the staffing associated with that. As far as the early literacy is concerned, we're not expanding it beyond the Willow Ridge feeder pattern, but we are adding the additional staff to expand it so that the incoming pre-K and kindergartners for all of those campuses can transition through that center. So we've added additional resources there. For the gifted and talented program, we're continuing to enhance that. As you recall, a GT director has been appointed, and then we added the liaison stipends for campuses that were previously approved by the board at just under just over $200,000. The early college high school was a big investment in both the Marshall, Willow Ridge, and Hightower feeder patterns. There's $1.2 million associated with the staffing to move those programs forward. And then for special education, based on the population growth we're seeing, there's $11 million in new staffing associated with the special education department. And then finally, for threat assessment teams, you all recall in the current year, before we've transitioned into a new one, some additional resources were added in. This includes the recurring expenses associated with that, as well as adding counselors and school psychologists and public information officer to help directly address those issues. And briefly on the special education side, I think that you all are very familiar with this slide, but basically after the corrective action plan was issued by the state, we have seen a tremendous growth in SPED population, and we do anticipate SPED population to be about 10% of enrollment versus a national average of 13% in 1920. So we expect that growth to continue at least for the next 2 to 3 years as we get closer to that 13% threshold. On the full-day pre-K, very briefly on this, it is mandated now by House Bill 3. As you recall, we do have about 20 campuses currently offering pre-K, 18 of those on a half-day basis, 2 on a full-time basis. However, when we go to full-day pre-K, we do expect an increase in the number of students served, and we're anticipating about 2,800 new students, or I'm sorry, not new students, but 2,800 students being served, and we'll need an additional 80 pre-K teachers and about 86 additional aides on the pre-K side, and then on the special ed side, an additional 21 staff members to assist with that program. The overall cost of that, again, is the $9.1 million that we have. A couple of key things to point out is that we do have available classrooms district-wide, so we'll be prioritizing placements within the elementary school feeder pattern campuses. However, based on limited number of teachers and funding, we may have to look at how we do that because, as I said, it's one of those things where the priority placement will be within the feeder pattern zones, but there may not be capacity there, so those will be things that we consider as we go into full-day pre-K. To look at how things look as we end this year and move into next year, for the 18-19, which is the second column, we do anticipate ending this year better. You'll see the budget, and we're expecting to end with about a $4.1 million surplus. The source of that surplus was, as you may recall, we've discussed with you previously, we had additional SHARS revenue come in, as well as the audits on property tax that's added additional revenue in that's helped offset some of our expenditures. So as we went into the year, we were expecting to use about $6 million in economic stabilization. As it happens, we will not be utilizing that, and that will be available for next year. And as you will be asked to approve at the next board meeting, we're recommending setting aside $10 million in economic stabilization for the 19-20 school year. So we've shared with you, we're expecting about $704.8 million in revenues. On the operating expenditure side, $717 million for the 19-20 school year. That does mean that we would be need to use about $10 million in economic stabilization. However, we will end the fiscal year at 90 days fund balance requirement as is required by board policy. For our 3-year outlook, what I will mention is that we are, again, we've based everything on current law because we don't have clarity. So we're assuming property value growth of 5% and also that 3% transition grant that the state has provided that's worth about $18 to $19 million per year. On the expenditure side, we're growing staff based on enrollment growth. We have the additional provisions built in for early college, high school teachers to support that program's growth. Special education is expected to grow, as I mentioned a moment ago, so we have $4 million for that, and then additional costs for health fund increases. We also have compensation adjustments of 3% per year built in. As we mentioned, we're expecting that this is something that will need to occur to remain competitive because after this year, if we don't do anything, obviously the other districts will likely move on that. We have startup costs for personnel for elementaries 52 and 53 built in. And then finally, in years 22 and 23, we have the support personnel for the opening of high school 12 built in. So I want you all to brace yourselves and gird yourself when I go to this next slide because it's not pretty. So as you look at this, is the 3%, really the bottom line on this is when we look at the compensation adjustments, that's what's driving the fund balance requirement to drop down below 90 days. However, I want to emphasize that this is a picture of what things could look like. We've mentioned the need to do a TRE. This is not including those revenues from a TRE. So if we do nothing, obviously this would not be sustainable. Based on board policy, we will not bring forward a budget that does not meet the 90-day operating reserve requirement. So again, this is more to show a picture of how things look based on legislation as it is currently written, and we understand it. But again, we don't know what the effects of the comp ed will be or what the ultimate outcome of how we have to do compensation will be. So again, this is a picture based on things as we understand them today. It is very bleak, but again, I want to emphasize it includes compensation at 3% per year for 2021, 2022, and 2023. And if that wasn't something that we could afford, obviously we would not bring that to the board for consideration. But if we had to do it, this is how it would ultimately look. This is a chart that you all have seen before that essentially we are spending money well on how we educate students, and we would expect that to continue. And at this point, I don't know if you all want to take questions for this, or if we go straight into debt service.
We'll take a question or two. Mrs. Helliger?
Thank you. So before you got to that bleak slide, I was thinking that on slide 38, it looks like what I consider a $10 million stretch. Is that right?
So there is an anticipated shortfall of 10 million, but as you recall, each year we set aside economic stabilization funds to help bridge this so that we can stay within our fund balance policy requirement. But to answer your question directly, yes, there is an anticipated shortfall, but we have funds set aside to cover that.
So in this slide, you show that we use it. So how much do we normally set aside for economic stabilization?
For the current school year, we had about 6.5 million set aside.
I'm sorry? Get your mic closer. Oh, okay, sorry.
For the current year, we had about 6.5 million set aside. We were expected to use 5.9 million. We're not using any. For the upcoming year, we'll have 10 million set aside for economic stabilization.
And so for 2018, 2019, if I'm reading this correctly, because you said every year we put aside dollars for economic stabilization. From this graph, it doesn't show that we've done that. Am I not reading that correctly?
Well, what this is showing is the use of economic stabilization. I believe we may have a slide later that shows that, but typically within the CAFR each year, you will see a set aside for economic stabilization.
Okay.
There's actually an agenda item on tonight's agenda when we'll get into the fund balance.
Okay.
So that'll come up a little later in the meeting.
Okay. And then then when you show slide 41, this is as is. You know, I guess I would have. You're just doing this to excite me? You're doing this to make me nervous? Slide 41, because, you know, if I'm looking at a 3-year projection, right, as the rules stand today, as we interpreting it, I would then have expected to see another slide maybe to show how we would, some adjustments to that so we can see, you know, if this happens, because I'm assuming that we put a 3 to 5 year plan together, right, so that we can continuously look at that. I would make certain adjustments to 2021 through 2022 and 23, so that I can see how I would actually meet these meet our 90-day reserve requirements. So this to me just shows, you know.
Right. So really the main point of this slide is to show that if we are to remain competitive with our peers on pay, and we do think that 3% in the out years will get us competitive, even though some of those districts will be able to do a lot more than that. We built that into the expenditures, but really the point of this slide is to show that we are going to need more revenue to account for what we're going to have to accomplish. And that's why we're telling the board now that we fully anticipate recommending a TRE, just like we've been talking about before, for this potential year, but we're excluded from doing that. And we have enough money to get us through this year. But in order for us to really continue to move the ball forward and to stay competitive with our staff, we're going to have a big gap to make up in 2021. The only way I see that happening is through a tax ratification election.
Okay, maybe I didn't get that as part of it. And then, because I'm also thinking about adjustments, so I'm thinking TRE, and would there be possible adjustments, things that we've increased, that we end up having to, you know,
no, and so
back,
we're always looking at the expenditures, and so what everybody has to remember that going into the 18-19 year, we had significantly reduced the budget. We went through a long exercise to cut $13 million out of our budget. You know, so we've gotten a lot of the low hanging fruit, and a lot of our non-staff budgets have really been tightened. And so for us to really get down lower, it will require some drastic things if we are not able to have a positive outcome on a TRE.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Helliger. Mrs. James?
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. And so just to pick up on what Addie was saying, I kind of agree with her to a certain degree. It would be helpful for us to see what a budget going out 3 years would look like that actually met our requirements, because then if the status quo remains, because then we can understand, I mean, it's coming from the reverse side, right, to understand this is the reason that we need the TRE, because
Mhm.
that's another piece of the puzzle, I guess, to understand it. So, Ms. Helliger, I kind of agree with you that it would be helpful to see that. So that would be my thought on that. It's like it's the reality version, right?
Can I interject on that? Because I want to manage expectations, because we absolutely agree with you, but I think the board, we can appreciate we put all this together very quickly. And so that's the kind of decision-making, if we're trying to close a $53 million gap, that is not something we're gonna, that's not even surgical. That is just slicing and dicing, we can't really close it. So the goal would be, we want to tell the story of where we're going, get a lot of the clarity around what TEA is going to provide us, and then we're already planning a strong campaign to let the community know about all of this and exactly what you all are describing, what it looks like if we don't do a TRE. But also, as you know, we're gonna have to tighten up on expenditures, and so that's a big part of the story. It can't be just give us more. It's gonna be, we're gonna meet here with expenditures, but it's gonna take revenues. But with special ed growing and these other areas that are important to not just the board and district, but to the community. The community wants academies to grow. They want GT to grow. Special ed has to grow. So as we address those key issues, then it's gonna take the revenue to do that and finding other areas to trim.
Right, so that's a good point, so thanks for sharing that. And I guess what I'm trying to get at, or what we maybe need help as this conversation continues, and probably continues in the fall, is quantifying that and looking at the pieces of the puzzle in a little more detail. And I get it, right? Because as the budget grows, the actual dollar amount in the fund balance needed also grows. So it's like a compounding problem in terms of it. We have, more and more employees, and all of them need pay, and the problem compounds. I'm just trying to understand what the pieces of the puzzle are, and I think that's what Addie was saying in terms of understanding the reality of the situation, so that we can, instead of speaking in hypothetical numbers, that we can say, this is what this means in terms of a raise or special ed education or GT education and those kinds of things you just said. So I think we're agreeing. It's just having the tools to talk about it.
Ms. James, whenever we show an amendment in the future, we'll update this slide with what we know, and then we'll also update one without raises in terms of what it would look like on a more realistic basis, without a TRE. So anyway, we'll have something for you in the future.
Okay, that would be great. So I just want to go back to what you started with, the whole concept of the raises for the staff. So thank you for working on that and getting that to putting that in a way that's competitive to our surrounding districts, and that's fair and equitable to our staff, because to me that's really important, and I appreciate that you've put some work into that and you've gone up above the mandate in order for us to remain competitive. And the price tag of that is $25 million essentially, and I get that, and that's a big number that impacts the look going forward. So I guess that's a thank you. Did I understand you to say that in that slide that was early on with the 25 million, that was including all the additional pre-K staff and all the that we haven't necessarily added so far, but we know that we will need to add going forward? Is that, because that'll come to us in a separate item, right? The FTEs that we'll need to add for those positions?
For the pre-K positions, yes, it will. But the long and short of it is the $717 million is inclusive of those additional positions needed, as well as the compensation increase.
Okay, so it's all included, and that's kind of what I assumed, but thank you for clarifying that. So what would if we were explaining this budget to people in our community, what is the percentage of this budget that is personnel and people and benefits essentially? Do you know what that number or what that roughly that
On an object
percentage would be?
basis. Did we calculate that?
Roughly 90%. We've gotten to the point where, because as Steve mentioned, when we made the adjustments last year on the O&M side, that we have tilted to the point where we're right at 90% on personnel versus supplies and materials.
Okay, so that's a good number for us to know. Thank you for sharing that. And then I really noticed on the slide where you showed the goals and the impact we were making, or what we were doing to address our district goals and objectives. I mean, those are all personnel things.
Yes, ma'am.
It really, that's what we're putting the money in our budget into is people, and that makes sense as we're a people-oriented business. So, okay, thank you. I think that's my questions for now.
Mrs. Tossan?
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. So I'm just going to follow up on what Mrs. James was saying, because that was the point I was going to make, is that we were previously at about 86% salary and benefits. Now we're pushing 90% salary and benefits. So really what we're looking at, I mean, you said, well, we'll update the slide to do it without the pay raises, because what else are we going to cut? I mean, it's either no pay raises or a RIF, or we're cutting. I mean, even when you cut literacy, you're cutting people. When you cut ed, you're cutting people. We're cutting fine arts, we're cutting people. So at this point, it sounds like what we're looking at is we either going to give the raises or we're not going to give the raises.
So if we had a unsuccessful TRE next year, okay,
That'll be,
then, yeah, it would hurt, and we wouldn't be able to give raises, and there's a lot of other investments we wouldn't be able to make. I don't think that we would have to do a RIF, though, but we would stop hiring.
right.
Okay,
So we're looking
when
at
a district our size, if we turn the faucet off in terms of stopping the hiring, we would save tens of millions within a short amount of time. I mean, within a year's time. But that means that remaining staff, because there's always turnover, that means the remaining staff is pedaling that much faster,
Right.
and it gets to be very difficult.
And I think, Steve, you need to point out clearly what that means. It means higher class sizes at every grade level. I mean, because we're talking over 50% of our workforce is teachers. So if we stop hiring teachers, we're going to be asking more teachers to carry more load. And
Right.
that's really the heart of it.
Right, because we
this
don't
whole
really
thing.
get around, like, we could get around some of our board priorities, but we're not gonna get around special ed. That's legal.
Exactly right.
I mean, that's, so there's no cutting special ed. There's no cutting, I mean, so at this point, we're looking, I mean, we're just trying to take care of our people. And to me, that's what the message is, because I think, to Ms. Helliger's and Mrs. James' point, is that the alternative is not hiring people to take care of our kids. And there's not a lot else there to be able to cut out. And even if we started, cutting out, if we found programs or things to cut out, you're not talking a major impact to the budget. Not enough to cover this. My only other question was Harvey money. Where is Harvey money in this? I know that's a one-time, but I know that could impact, I know we have to pay ourselves back for some things, but will that impact economic stabilization? And can we
Yes,
put that
yes,
money
it
away?
will, and we still don't know that number, and that number is not in here. But we still don't
So
know.
that's
We've
gonna
asked. We've
Clearly
asked.
going to impact the budget and where our economic stabilization might be in.
It will help us with managing the fund balance, but it is just one-time
or
funding.
fund balance.
We've asked for clarity. Hopefully, we'll learn something at the end of this by the end of this month. But it's like $800 million has been set aside. Now, some of that's already been paid through the comp ed adjustments that were made before, but we are expecting a share of that. But how much that is, we don't know yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Tossan. Mr. Rice?
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. So, Mr. Bassett, and I was going to say, Ms. Haliger, what this should tell us, you had a comment, should I be alarmed? And the answer is yes, you should be alarmed. And we should all be alarmed about this. If we stopped hiring teachers, if we normally lose 10% of our teachers a year due to attrition, that's 500 teachers a year. Think of 500 teachers leaving the district and no replacements. And that's happening every year right now. And when I think of our annual electric bill, which in the past was $15 million a year, I don't know what it is now. If we turned off the lights and air conditioning in every single facility we had for 3 years in a row, we couldn't make up $53 million. So that is a catastrophic number that can only be remedied through a TRE. There might be a few little things that we could try to cut and save on, but not enough to overcome that. And I have some information on having an efficiency audit. The Legislative Budget Board has been charged with formulating the guidelines, and they're due in January of 2020. So we're not going to have the guidelines probably before the election in November. They're not going to be done before then for political reasons. They're not sure what the qualifications are for an auditor. They're not sure what the scoring metric's going to be. Not really sure what it looks like. And the only thing they are sure of is that the Board of Trustees is responsible for getting it done. And so there's a time frame for having it conducted, I think not more than 4 months prior to the election. And then the results of that have got to be shared, I think, not 30 days or something like that before the election. And the board's got to approve it and everything, so that's something else we have to take in. So in practical terms, there's no way to have a TRE this year.
It is legislatively forbidden
Yeah.
to have it this year.
Yeah. And we can't take the other copy, the other golden penny yet this year either, right?
That is correct. It is not available until the following year.
We need to let the legislature bask in the glory of their so-called school finance fix. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Mrs. James, did you have something?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Reardon. I had one follow-up or one other question I didn't ask. On slide 39, you said one of the assumptions we made in this 3-year outlook was a 5% property value growth, but we talked before about a 2.5% cap. So how does that work? What does that mean?
Well, we're still assuming that we built this based on the 3% above current law. And so if that is our floor for revenue, and we do see that as being our floor for revenue up until the 23-24 year, that's how we built it.
Okay, so you're counting on a hold harmless in the 2.5% cap category. And so the property value growth is not, it's interesting, but it's not necessarily relevant to the.
It's not. I mean, it's not relevant in that regard because of the floor. Okay.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it's certainly going to be relevant in terms of how we calculate things, and with we're all taxpayers,
right.
of
And
course.
important to the taxpayers, but also where the money comes from. So these black boxes that the TEA is developing, it'll be impactful in determining some of that, or some of our revenue sources. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. So we're still basing it on the 3%.
Above current law, that's right.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. James.
Okay, so let me pick up then. So where we're at in terms of our debt service fund, we're healthy on that side. We've talked in the past about adding in the 2 pennies because of the acceleration of the high school. We are expecting to have a surplus to add to the fund balance, but when you think about it, after we make our payments at the end in August, our actual cash on hand will be down to 20 million, and so it's not necessarily as large as it seems. So here's a look at the tax rates combined. With the going from $1.06 to 99 pennies, you can see the change of 7 pennies there. The INS rate from 26 to 28. See the 2 penny increase there. The total tax rate change will be 5 pennies, going from $1.32 down to $1.27. Assuming the assessed value, the average market value for our residents, will go up almost 2.3%. So when all the math works out, they'll have a decline of about 1.36%, which works out to a decrease in taxes monthly of just under $3.80. So there is a decline, and it's about I'll throw this in. That's about the cost of a Whataburger. So anyway, yeah. So you get one Whataburger Junior a month. Okay. Let's let that sink in. And then we are, we do expect to have an increase in our child nutrition fund as we continue to try to work up the fund balance. But this does incorporate, what we've spoken about here with almost 46% of our enrollment in the free and reduced category. So the road ahead, we do anticipate bringing a budget amendment back to the board when we have clarity on Harvey relief, which would be a one-time number, and then when we know more about the state comp ed numbers. Again, I'm expecting that to actually get us above the hold harmless amount. We'll see. I don't think it's going to be a major windfall though to bring us well above that hold harmless number. But we'll see. We will adopt the tax rate in our normal time frame. In the September timeframe, but we are expecting, as we've discussed, the need to do a TRE in November 2020. Mr. Rice mentioned the efficiency audit. That'll have to be done a full 4 months, completed 4 months before that time. So we're gonna have to go through the selection process for that auditor, early in 2020. Hopefully, the guidance will be out and published by then. But we are going to be expecting more tax rate compression. What exactly that'll look like. Hopefully we'll be able to, hopefully we'll be able to show you some things as what it could look like in terms of real numbers in the future mixing the student counts in there.
One thing I did want to interject is next week, we are going to have the public hearing at 5:30 p.m. and the proposed budget adoption during the regular meeting at 6 p.m. next week. Another critical thing that we did not get in this presentation is we are going to ask you to take action to approve the salaries so that we can begin communication, because we're in that critical period where there could be movement if we don't secure them and the pay. But it's one thing we heard from David Thompson last week at Region 4 is that we don't expect this to be the case in Fort Bend, but in the event that the comp ed calculations come in such a way that we end up with a bigger increase than we're projecting, that could drive us to have further increase the salaries through a budget amendment later on, because of the mandate. But there's also a legal technicality that says you cannot adjust salaries after someone has begun performance on their contract. So when we ask you to approve that next week, it will include language that says we have accounted for that and that the board is expecting the possibility of having to increase salaries in the future. We don't expect it because we're going so high with our increase, so far above the minimum. But just in the event we did get trapped in that, David Thompson recommended that we include the language that says the board had anticipated the possibility, so that a way that allows us to recommend salary increases later on, if only if the minimum amount would come up.
Yeah, that's going to need to be in the compensation adjustments in the future, because this is being built into any basic allotment increase in the future is going to roll into mandated salary increase. So we mentioned kind of the legislative deja vu. We spoke about the quote from Carol Keaton Strayhorn. So Representative Martinez Fisher actually gave this quote, and he brought up potential of reliving things in the 2011 legislative session because of the compression. And I hope that's not where we end up, but we weren't the only one thinking about that. So we have the adoption, the final amendment, the fund balance resolution. Those are some of the items that we'll be discussing. In July, we received the certified tax roll. We have the choice selection for Chapter 41. I think that's actually has a new number now. I don't know if I think it's 48 and 49. So we'll have to fix that in our documents. And then we'll be adopting the tax rate in September. When we'll bring an amended budget, I'm not sure yet, but we'll certainly let you know as we get clarity. But this is the actions that we see coming up. Okay.
Mrs. Tossan?
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. I just have two quick comments. First one is, I want to actually say out loud, $45.54 a year. That's what the average taxpayer is going to save after all of this. $45.54. The only other thing I want to say is that, when you mentioned we had to get legal advice from David Thompson, and we've got Steve Bassett and Brian Gwynn, and we have other lawyers sitting in our meetings today, and all this executive staff sitting around this table right here that has to deal with the changes and all of this that gets dumped on us. Thank goodness it's every other year and not every year. I just want to say out loud that all of you earn your 2% that's in that budget. So it's things like this that require school districts to pay highly qualified and experienced people like all of you and those of you sitting in the audience and like David Thompson, in order to make sure that we are complying with the law and following the mandates and following the rules. And so we take a lot of criticism for paying administrators and legal and all of this, and this is why we do it, and we have to do it. So I just wanted to point that out, because we just sat through an hour and 40-minute presentation on House Bill 3 and Senate Bill 2 and a budget proposal and all the new mandates, and a lot of the questions are still unanswered. But it requires a team of very qualified and very experienced people, and I, for one, am very thankful to have the team that we have. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Mrs. Tossan. Mr. Rice?
Well said, Mrs. Tossan. Well said. And I just have one question, Dr. Dupree. Do we have any Pepto-Bismol in the back?
We do.
Well, I want to start off by thanking Mr. Bassett and Mr. Gwynn for compiling all this information and doing the best you can to decipher it. It's obvious that it's nearly impossible by design to clearly be able to articulate what this means to our community. And I think that we can all agree that when we do have some definites, the key is going to be communication. And looks like our staff has a challenging task ahead. So, as Mrs. Tossan said, thank you all for all that you do. This is what we do, and this is how education works. So, I appreciate that. We will now convene in closed session under the Texas Open Meeting Act, Chapter 551, and those sections listed in the agenda, and for the purpose of private consultation with the board's attorney as on any or all subject matters authorized by law. We are now convened in closed session.